By the late 8th century, a quiet schism within Shurism was already producing a revolutionary alternative to Abbasid authority. The origins of the Ismaili branch of Shurism are closely tied to the succession disputes following the death of the 6th Shura'i Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, in 765 CE. Al-Sadiq's death prompted a division over the rightful succession, with a segment of his followers recognizing Ismail ibn Jafar, his eldest son, as the legitimate imam. Other factions supported Musa al-Kazim, creating a fundamental theological and political split. Contemporary Sunni sources, including heresiographical works such as al-Baghdadi's al-Farq Bain al-Firaq, record these debates as early evidence of the fragmentation within Shurism. Later Ismaili chronicles, including those preserved in Fatimid writings, present a more coherent narrative of missionary activity and doctrinal emphasis on esoteric knowledge, highlighting the complex intellectual underpinnings of the movement. During this period, the Abbasid Caliphate, with its capital at Baghdad, consolidated political authority across much of the Islamic world. The Ismailis operated as a minority sect within this environment, requiring clandestine organization to ensure survival. Dawa networks, functioning as both religious and social infrastructure, spread across Khorasan, Iraq, and the Hijaz. Missionaries, or da'is, were tasked with propagating Ismaili doctrine, identifying loyal adherents, and maintaining secrecy in the face of surveillance by the Abbasid administration. Records indicate that Ismaili communities relied heavily on coded correspondence and selective oral instruction to transmit teachings, emphasizing loyalty, doctrinal clarity, and discretion. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that Ismaili communities were often centered in urban environments where commercial networks allowed mobility and communication. Surviving coins, inscriptions, and references in Abbasid administrative registers suggest that members of the sect were integrated into wider economic and social systems, even while maintaining a parallel religious hierarchy. The combination of urban dispersion and tightly controlled internal hierarchy allowed Ismailis to survive repeated episodes of persecution, particularly under caliphs who viewed heterodox Shura'i factions as political threats. The intellectual foundations of early Ismailism emphasized a dual approach: the exoteric, visible practice of Islam accessible to the wider population, and the esoteric, inner knowledge reserved for initiated adherents. This distinction, referred to in Fatimid and later Nizari writings as the baton, required disciplined instruction and loyalty. Primary sources indicate that Ismaili missionaries developed structured curricula, including theological, philosophical, and legal instruction. In particular, the use of allegorical interpretation of Quranic verses allowed the movement to maintain doctrinal coherence across distant and dispersed communities. Sunni heresiographies, while often polemical, corroborate the existence of secretive organizational methods and dedicated networks of propagators. By the end of the 8th century, Ismaili communities had begun to establish identifiable social and political patterns. Sunni accounts such as those in Kitab al-Farq note that Ismaili groups engaged in political agitation, though details are often fragmentary and exaggerated. Later Fatimid texts, however, emphasize the systematic and deliberate approach of early Ismaili leadership, framing survival as dependent on intellectual discipline, hierarchical loyalty, and adaptive strategies. Missionary activity combined theological argumentation with careful assessment of local political conditions, allowing small networks to persist and expand even under hostile conditions. The movement's dependence on secrecy and doctrinal rigor also shaped its political culture. Leaders exercised authority through carefully controlled channels, ensuring that knowledge and decision-making were limited to trusted individuals. This system reinforced cohesion and reduced vulnerability to infiltration or defection. Surviving documents suggest that these early structures directly informed the later administrative and military models of the Fatimid and Nizari states. The emphasis on education, loyalty, and covert communication established a precedent for future Ismaili governance that integrated religious authority with practical political considerations. By the mid-8th century, the Ismaili Dawa had become a distinct presence within the Abbasid world, not only as a religious movement but as a proto-political network capable of long-term organization. Their emphasis on secrecy, doctrinal instruction, and disciplined hierarchy allowed the movement to maintain continuity across generations, despite the absence of a territorial base. This period represents the foundation of Ismaili political identity, situating religious authority as the central organizing principle of communal life. As Ismaili doctrine matured, its political ambitions found expression in a new imperial experiment. For the first time, Ismaili doctrine ruled not in secret but as empire. The Fatimid Caliphate was formally established in 909 CE by Ubayd Allah al-Mahdi Billah, asserting control over the Maghrib and later extending its authority into Egypt. This development marked a decisive transition from the clandestine operations of early Ismaili Dawa networks to the public exercise of state power. Archaeological surveys in North Africa and Egypt reveal urban planning initiatives and fortress construction consistent with centralized administration, demonstrating the Caliphate's practical capacity to govern extensive territories. Contemporary Sunni historians, including al-Makrizi, provide critical accounts of the Fatimid regime, noting both its administrative sophistication and the challenges posed by doctrinal heterogeneity within the Ismaili community. Cairo, founded in 969 CE under Caliph al-Mu'izz din Allah, became the political and religious heart of the Fatimid state. The city was designed to integrate government administration, military organization, and religious scholarship into a coherent urban framework. The construction of Al-Azhar Mosque and its associated teaching institutions served as a mechanism for both disseminating Ismaili doctrine and cultivating a class of educated bureaucrats loyal to the caliphate. Administrative documents and surviving endowment records illustrate how taxation, urban planning, and religious instruction were coordinated to reinforce the legitimacy of the Imam Caliph. This integration of spiritual and temporal authority allowed the Fatimids to consolidate control across a culturally and geographically diverse population. Institutional Dawa functioned as a cornerstone of Fatimid governance. Dawahs operated in both rural and urban settings, promoting Ismaili religious teachings while simultaneously supporting political objectives. Surviving correspondence, preserved in Fatimid archives, indicates that missionaries were tasked with recruitment, education, and surveillance of local communities. The hierarchical structure of Dawa mirrored the broader state apparatus, ensuring that doctrinal instruction and administrative oversight were mutually reinforcing. Sunni polemical texts confirm that these activities were highly visible and perceived as politically subversive, demonstrating that the Fatimids' religious initiatives had tangible implications for the wider Islamic world. Despite centralized authority, the Fatimid state faced tensions between imperial objectives and doctrinal diversity. Regional Dawa agents maintained varying interpretations of Ismaili teachings, occasionally challenging the caliph's directives. Primary sources, including letters between regional governors and the caliph, reveal that disputes over succession, ritual practice, and theological emphasis required careful negotiation. Archaeological evidence from provincial capitals suggests that the Fatimid administration relied on a combination of military presence and religious legitimacy to mediate these internal divergences. The capacity to accommodate doctrinal variation while maintaining state coherence was a defining feature of Fatimid governance, illustrating the balance between ideological rigor and practical administration. The caliphate's economic and military strategies were closely intertwined with its ideological objectives. Fatimid coinage, inscriptions, and administrative records indicate the promotion of trade networks connecting North Africa, the Levant, and the Red Sea. Revenue from these networks funded both urban development and military campaigns. The caliphate maintained fortified cities and naval bases to project power and defend trade routes, demonstrating a clear link between governance, economic management, and religious legitimacy. The strategic alignment of these systems reflects the extent to which Ismaili doctrine informed practical statecraft, transforming religious authority into instruments of centralized control. By the end of the 10th century, the Fatimid Caliphate had established a precedent for organized Ismaili governance that extended far beyond the clandestine operations of its predecessors. The combination of urban planning, centralized administration, institutional dawa, and integrated military strategy created a durable political model. Archaeological and textual evidence shows that these measures allowed the Fatimids to govern diverse populations effectively while maintaining the primacy of the imam's authority. However, the very success of this model introduced new vulnerabilities, particularly regarding succession disputes, which would later catalyze the fragmentation of the Ismaili movement. Imperial success intensified succession pressures that would fracture Ismailism permanently. Hassan I Sabah approached revolution not as a warlord, but as an administrator. Hassan I Sabah was born around 1050 CE in the city of Qom, located in the northern Iranian plateau. Contemporary biographical accounts, preserved in later Persian and Arabic chronicles, indicate that he was educated in local religious and philosophical schools, acquiring proficiency in Quranic exegesis, theology, and classical logic. His early intellectual development coincided with a period of political fragmentation in the region, characterized by competing Seljuk authorities, local dynasts, and shadowy movements. Records from later Ismaili sources suggest that Hassan displayed exceptional aptitude in religious scholarship and was drawn to the teachings of the Nizari branch of Ismailism, which had evolved out of the Fatimid Dawa networks operating covertly in Persia. Hassan's transition to Ismaili thought involved both doctrinal study and practical engagement with missionary networks. Historical reconstructions indicate that he traveled to major centers of learning, including Ray and Baghdad, where he encountered Ismaili da'is operating under the supervision of regional Dawa leaders. Documents preserved in Fatimid archives and referenced in Sunni heresiographical works suggest that Hassan's early involvement included instruction in theological debate, community organization, and methods of clandestine communication. These experiences provided the foundation for his later emphasis on hierarchical discipline and carefully structured authority within the Nizari movement. Medieval biographical sources, including the works of Ibn al-Qalanisi and later Nizari historians, describe Hassan I Sabah as a meticulous strategist with a focus on long-term ideological objectives rather than immediate military confrontation. He developed a systematic approach to organizational control, insisting on rigorous loyalty among disciples and strict adherence to doctrinal interpretation. Evidence from surviving letters attributed to Hassan and his contemporaries suggests that he codified procedures for selection, education, and deployment of adherents. These records indicate that Hassan's strategy was designed to ensure ideological cohesion across geographically dispersed communities, effectively transforming intellectual conviction into operational structure. Archaeological studies of Persian fortress sites later associated with Nizari control, while constructed after Hassan's direct activity, corroborate the emphasis on strategic planning and administrative organization. The evidence suggests that Hassan's approach to leadership prioritized the creation of durable institutions capable of maintaining internal discipline, overseeing covert networks, and sustaining doctrinal integrity. The hierarchical model he established involved clear chains of authority, with trusted deputies overseeing local cells of missionaries and community members. This structure allowed for both centralized ideological control and decentralized operational flexibility, enabling the Nizaris to persist under conditions of persecution and political instability. Hassan I Sabah's education and intellectual formation were inseparable from the broader context of regional instability and ideological contestation. The Seljuk Sultanate, fragmented local polities, and rival Shi'i and Sunni movements created an environment in which traditional methods of authority were often insufficient. Hassan recognized that the survival of the Nizari movement depended not only on religious devotion but also on administrative precision, disciplined recruitment, and coherent strategic planning. Surviving Fatimid correspondence and later historical analyses suggest that Hassan viewed knowledge, hierarchy, and loyalty as the most effective instruments for sustaining a religiously driven political organization. By the time Hassan assumed leadership of Nizari networks in Persia, his ideological training had been reinforced by both scholarly engagement and practical organizational experience. He emphasized a culture of secrecy, rigorous training, and doctrinal uniformity among his followers. These elements, combined with strategic intelligence gathering and long-term planning, distinguished Hassan I Sabah from contemporaneous military leaders, demonstrating that his approach to revolutionary politics was grounded in administrative and ideological principles rather than brute force. The early formation of this organizational ethos directly influenced the later development of the Nizari state at Alamut and the broader network of Ismaili fortresses across Persia. Ideological conviction soon required territorial security. A remote mountain fortress became the nerve center of a new political system. Alamut, located in the Rudbar region of northern Persia, occupies a steep, forested valley in the southern Alborz Mountains. Medieval Persian chroniclers, including Rashid al-Din and later Nizari historians, described the fortress as nearly impregnable due to its elevation, natural cliffs, and limited access points. Archaeological surveys conducted at the site confirm extensive fortifications, including reinforced walls, water cisterns, and terrace structures adapted to the mountainous terrain. These features provided both defense against external threats and the infrastructure necessary for sustained habitation, making Alamut an ideal location for the consolidation of a clandestine political network. The takeover of Alamut in 1090 CE, traditionally attributed to Hassan I Sabah, is documented as a methodical and largely nonviolent process. Accounts indicate that Hassan and a small cadre of loyal followers infiltrated the fortress under the guise of religious visitors and laborers. Persian chroniclers emphasize that the seizure relied on careful persuasion and the strategic placement of trusted adherents rather than open combat. Letters and later Nizari chronicles describe Hassan's meticulous planning, which included cultivating local support, assessing the loyalty of the garrison, and exploiting rivalries among regional Seljuk authorities. This approach allowed the fortress to be secured efficiently while minimizing casualties and drawing minimal attention. Geography played a decisive role in the strategic value of Alamut. Situated at an elevation exceeding 2,000 meters above sea level, the fortress provided panoramic views of surrounding valleys and access to concealed mountain paths. This position enabled early warning of approaching forces and limited avenues of direct assault. Archaeological evidence, including remnants of defensive gates and watchtowers, corroborates textual descriptions of these advantages. The combination of isolation and natural defensibility allowed Alamut to function not merely as a refuge but as a command center for broader Nizari operations across Persia. Fortification design at Alamut reflected both military pragmatism and long-term habitation. Structures within the fortress included residential quarters, armories, storage facilities, and water management systems. Cisterns and aqueducts ensured year-round water supply, supporting both the garrison and agricultural plots within the walls. Excavations have revealed terraces and stone foundations that align with medieval Persian descriptions of Hassan's efforts to maintain a self-sustaining environment. The architectural choices indicate a deliberate intention to create a fortress capable of supporting both defensive operations and ideological consolidation over extended periods. The seizure of Alamut also illustrates the integration of political, ideological, and military strategy. Hassan's approach combined careful assessment of local social networks with doctrinal authority. Letters preserved in later Fatimid and Nizari archives describe his use of religious instruction and persuasion to secure loyalty among inhabitants and neighboring communities. This combination of soft power and strategic positioning established a model for Nizari governance that would be replicated at other mountain fortresses in Khwistan and northern Persia. The fortress thus became a center not only of defense but of ideological instruction, intelligence gathering, and administrative control. Contemporary Sunni accounts emphasize the unusual nature of Hassan's success, noting that few other groups could have captured a fortified site so securely without resorting to violence. These sources, while often critical, confirm that Alamut's seizure was both precise and enduring. The operation demonstrates the effectiveness of disciplined planning, hierarchical control, and the integration of ideology into practical governance. Hassan's leadership transformed Alamut from a remote mountain stronghold into the operational nucleus of a nascent Nizari state. Following the takeover, Alamut became a hub for recruiting, training, and coordinating the wider Nizari network. Missionaries and administrators operated from the fortress, using it as a center for doctrinal education and operational planning. Archaeological evidence suggests that the fortress could accommodate a substantial population while maintaining security and secrecy. This dual function, defensive bastion and administrative center, exemplifies the Nizari emphasis on strategic adaptability, combining intellectual and logistical resources to sustain a politically vulnerable movement. By the close of the 11th century, Alamut had established its role as the nerve center of Nizari Ismaili power in Persia. Its seizure demonstrated that territorial control could be achieved through planning, persuasion, and careful integration of ideology with strategic geography. The fortress provided the foundation for the expansion of the Nizari network and the development of the Fida-I system of loyal operatives. Alamut was not merely a refuge, it was a blueprint. Geography became the Nizari's greatest ally, Following the establishment of Alamut as the central hub of Nizari authority, Hassan I Sabah and his successors pursued a systematic expansion of fortress holdings across northern Persia, particularly in the regions of Daylam and Quistan. Medieval Persian chronicles and later Nizari sources record that the movement prioritized locations offering natural defensibility, strategic oversight of trade routes, and proximity to loyal communities. Archaeological surveys confirm the presence of multiple mountain fortresses, including Lamsar, Girdku, and Falako Elaflak, characterized by steep approaches, elevated vantage points, and access to water sources. These fortresses were carefully selected to facilitate surveillance, limit the mobility of hostile forces, and maintain secure lines of communication between nodes in the network. The acquisition of these strongholds relied on a combination of persuasion, infiltration, and limited force. Accounts from Nizari historians indicate that local garrisons were often co-opted through negotiation and religious authority rather than direct assault. The presence of trusted dayas within surrounding villages helped to consolidate loyalty and monitor potential threats. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that many sites were equipped with watchtowers, signaling systems, and cisterns, suggesting a high level of logistical planning. These features allowed rapid communication across mountainous terrain, using both visual signals and messengers, enabling coordination of defensive operations and administrative oversight over dispersed populations. Topography shaped both settlement patterns and military strategy. Fortresses were sited on ridgelines, cliffs, or inaccessible plateaus, maximizing natural defensive advantages and creating choke points that were difficult to assault. Excavations at Lamsar and Girdku reveal stone walls integrated into the contours of the cliffs, as well as terraces for habitation and storage. Water management infrastructure, including cisterns and channels, ensured that fortresses could withstand prolonged sieges. The integration of natural features with engineered fortifications reflects a sophisticated understanding of the terrain and its tactical potential. The Persian fortress strategy was complemented by carefully maintained logistical networks. Supply routes connected fortresses to surrounding villages, enabling the transfer of food, arms, and information while minimizing exposure to hostile forces. Surviving administrative records and medieval chronicles describe the coordination of these networks under central leadership, with Alamut functioning as the principal hub. This system allowed the Nizaris to project influence beyond a single stronghold and to maintain operational continuity across a region that was politically fragmented and often hostile. Communication systems were central to the effectiveness of the network. Visual signaling, such as beacon fires and reflective devices, allowed messages to be transmitted across valleys and ridgelines within hours. Messengers traveled along secure mountain paths to deliver detailed instructions, coordinate recruitment, and report on enemy movements. Letters preserved in later Nizari archives indicate that correspondence between fortresses included doctrinal instruction, security updates, and administrative directives, demonstrating the integration of ideological, military, and bureaucratic functions. These mechanisms allowed the Nizaris to exercise centralized control despite the decentralized geographic dispersion of their holdings. The fortress strategy also reinforced internal cohesion and loyalty. Each site was managed by a local commander subordinate to the central authority at Alamut, with strict adherence to hierarchical discipline and doctrinal instruction. Chroniclers note that the selection of commanders emphasized loyalty, intelligence, and administrative competence, reflecting Hassan I Sabah's earlier organizational principles. This combination of structural discipline, strategic positioning, and communication capability allowed the Nizaris to withstand attacks from larger Seljuk forces and maintain long-term operational stability. By the mid-12th century, the Persian fortress network had become a durable system for both defense and administration. Each stronghold served multiple functions: military bastion, administrative center, and hub for Dawar activity. Archaeological and textual evidence indicates that fortresses were not isolated outposts but components of an integrated network that enabled the Nizaris to exercise influence across northern Persia. This approach demonstrates the practical application of geographic advantage, hierarchical governance, and logistical coordination to sustain a politically and militarily vulnerable movement. Political survival required influence beyond Persia. Syria offered chaos and opportunity. By the late 11th century, the Seljuk Sultanate's authority in Syria had weakened, creating a fragmented political landscape in which multiple principalities and local emirs competed for control. Concurrently, the arrival of Crusader states introduced new military actors and alliances into the region. Contemporary chronicles, including the works of Ibn al-Qalanisi and William of Tyre, describe the instability of Aleppo, Damascus, and surrounding mountain regions, highlighting the strategic openings available to organized, disciplined movements. The Nizari Ismailis seized this opportunity, extending their network of fortresses beyond Persia into the Levantine theater. The initial Syrian settlements focused on the Jabal Bara region, a mountainous area west of Aleppo that offered natural fortifications similar to those in the Alborz Mountains. Medieval accounts, including the Tariq-i-Jibal, note that Hassan I Sabah dispatched trusted Dawiz and commanders to survey terrain, establish loyal enclaves, and identify weakly defended strongholds suitable for acquisition. Archaeological surveys of sites such as Masyaf and Abu Kubris indicate fortified positions adapted to mountainous terrain, including elevated towers, cisterns, and terraced habitations. These features allowed the Nizaris to replicate the Persian model of defense, surveillance, and administrative oversight while adapting to local conditions. The Nizaris relied on a combination of negotiation, persuasion, and strategic intelligence to secure Syrian fortresses. Accounts from local chroniclers report that commanders often co-opted disaffected or independent garrisons, emphasizing religious affiliation, loyalty, and disciplined governance rather than open warfare. Letters preserved in later Fatimid archives suggest coordination between Alamut and Syrian cells, providing guidance on doctrinal instruction, recruitment, and operational security. This approach allowed the Nizaris to establish footholds without provoking large-scale military retaliation, demonstrating continuity with Persian fortress strategy while adapting to the geopolitical realities of Syria. Urban centers such as Aleppo and Damascus were closely monitored through both intelligence networks and political alliances. Dawiz engaged with local merchants, clergy, and minor officials to maintain awareness of Seljuk and Crusader activities. Chroniclers note that these intelligence operations facilitated early warning of hostile movements and informed strategic decisions regarding fortress acquisition and defensive deployment. Archaeological evidence, including defensive outposts and observation points in the Jabal Bara region, corroborates textual accounts of a structured system of surveillance and communication, extending from urban peripheries to fortified positions. The complex interplay between Crusader and Muslim polities required the Nizaris to adapt their methods. Unlike in Persia, where Seljuk's central authority provided predictable political boundaries, Syria was characterized by shifting alliances and localized power struggles. Contemporary sources, including Latin chronicles, indicate that Nizari operations were calculated to avoid confrontation with stronger forces, relying instead on targeted control of mountain fortresses and strategic passes. Coordination with sympathetic local factions enabled the Nizaris to maintain influence without direct engagement, reinforcing the principle of survival through strategic positioning and disciplined administration. Communication between Syrian fortresses and Alamut was critical to maintaining ideological cohesion and operational control. Reports from the period, preserved in later Ismaili compilations, describe the use of secure messenger routes and coded correspondence to transmit directives, doctrinal instruction, and intelligence. Fortresses were structured to support both administrative coordination and military readiness, including storage facilities, garrison housing, and defensive works. Archaeological findings at Masyaf indicate terraced fortifications designed to accommodate both permanent inhabitants and seasonal operational personnel, reflecting a model of sustainable fortress management consistent with Persian practices. By the end of the 12th century, Syrian fortresses had become integral nodes in the Nizari network. Their establishment enabled the movement to influence regional politics, monitor competing powers, and provide secure bases for Dawa activity. The replication of Persian administrative and military principles in Syrian terrain illustrates the adaptability of Nizari strategy, combining doctrinal coherence with practical governance under conditions of political fragmentation. These settlements formed the foundation for later Nizari operations in the Levant, including engagement with Crusader states and alliances with local Muslim powers. Coexistence with rival powers required new tactics, Assassination was not terror, it was communication. By the early 12th century, the Nizari Ismaili movement faced a strategic reality defined by asymmetry. Surrounded by far larger military powers, Seljuk sultanates, local emirs, and later Crusader states, the Nizaris lacked the manpower and resources necessary for conventional warfare. Medieval sources consistently emphasized this imbalance. Rather than field armies, the Nizaris developed methods designed to influence political behavior without territorial conquest. Targeted killing emerged from this context not as indiscriminate violence, but as a calculated political instrument. Contemporary Muslim chroniclers such as Ibn al-Qalanisi, Juwayni, and later Rashid al-Din describe assassination as a response to structural vulnerability. Seljuk authority relied heavily on charismatic leadership, personal loyalty, and centralized administration. The removal of key figures, viziers, governors, military commanders, often produced cascading instability. In this environment, the assassination of an individual could achieve effects disproportionate to the resources expended. The Nizaris identified this vulnerability early and refined it systematically. It is critical to distinguish this practice from modern notions of terrorism. Nizari operations were highly selective, publicly visible, and symbolic. Targets were chosen for their political significance rather than their symbolic value alone. Chroniclers repeatedly note that victims were almost always elite figures directly involved in campaigns against Nizari communities or Dawa networks. Civilians were not targeted, nor were mass casualty tactics employed. The goal was not fear through randomness, but deterrence through precision. The intellectual origins of this strategy can be traced to Ismaili political thought. Fatimid-era texts emphasize the role of authority, legitimacy, and leadership in maintaining social order. Within this framework, rulers who persecuted the community were viewed as illegitimate and destabilizing forces. Removing such figures was framed as a defensive act rather than aggression. Later Nizari writings, though fragmentary, suggest that assassination was conceived as a form of political intervention aimed at correcting imbalance rather than overturning social order wholesale. Early documented cases reinforce this interpretation. The assassination of Seljuk Vizier Nizam al-Mulk in 1092 CE is the most frequently cited example, though modern historians caution against simplistic attribution. While later Sunni sources attribute the killing to Hassan I Sabbah's followers, contemporary accounts are ambiguous and often shaped by polemical intent. What is clear, however, is that the event profoundly influenced Seljuk stability and shaped perceptions of Nizari capability. Subsequent assassinations followed a recognizable pattern: public setting, identifiable perpetrator, and a clear connection between target and policy toward Ismaili communities. The performative aspect of these killings was intentional. Chroniclers describe assassinations occurring in mosques, courts, or public processions. These settings ensured witnesses and documentation. The act functioned as a message delivered through action. Opposition would carry consequences, while coexistence might ensure safety. Importantly, Nizari agents rarely attempted escape. This further reinforced the communicative function of the act, framing it as a deliberate intervention rather than criminal violence. Mythologization soon followed. Crusader chroniclers, unfamiliar with Ismaili doctrine and operating within their own cultural frameworks, exaggerated Nizari practices into tales of mind control, drug use, and blind fanaticism. The term assassin itself entered European languages through these distorted accounts. Modern scholarship, drawing on comparative source analysis and archaeological evidence, has systematically dismantled these narratives. No contemporary Muslim sources describe narcotics as part of training, nor do logistical realities support such claims. The myth served polemical and literary purposes rather than historical accuracy. What emerges instead is a picture of disciplined, trained operatives operating under strict constraints. Assassination was rare, not routine. Years might pass between operations, suggesting careful deliberation rather than habitual violence. Targets were debated, intelligence gathered, and consequences assessed. This selectivity enhanced the method's effectiveness, preserving its psychological impact and political credibility. The broader political environment also shaped the strategy's adoption. Seljuk governance relied heavily on personal authority rather than institutional continuity. Removing a single leader could fracture alliances, trigger succession disputes, or stall military campaigns. Nizari leaders exploited this fragility while avoiding direct confrontation. In doing so, they transformed their weakness into a strategic advantage, turning marginality into leverage. Importantly, assassination did not replace other forms of engagement. Diplomatic correspondence, negotiated truces, and tribute arrangements continued alongside targeted killings. Several Sunni rulers maintained pragmatic relationships with Nizari fortresses, recognizing that coexistence was preferable to provocation. The threat of assassination functioned as a stabilizing deterrent, shaping behavior without constant application. By the mid-12th century, assassination had become an established component of Nizari statecraft. It was integrated into a broader system of governance that included fortress administration, doctrinal education, intelligence gathering, and diplomacy. This integration distinguishes Nizari practice from spontaneous or purely ideological violence. It was strategy embedded within political structure. Understanding the origins of targeted killing within this framework allows for a reassessment of the Nizari's historical role. Rather than nihilistic fanatics, they emerge as political actors responding rationally to structural constraints. Their methods were extreme by modern standards, but coherent within their historical context. The effectiveness of assassination as communication depended not on terror alone, but on discipline, restraint, and credibility. The method required exceptional discipline. Obedience replaced numbers. The operational effectiveness of the Nizari assassination strategy relied fundamentally on the Fidai system, a network of highly trained, ideologically committed operatives. Chroniclers such as Juwayni, Ibn al-Qalanisi, and later Nizari texts describe Fidais as individuals who underwent rigorous preparation, both intellectual and practical, before participating in operations. Recruitment targeted young men and occasionally women from Ismaili communities, emphasizing loyalty to the imam, capacity for discipline, and commitment to doctrinal principles. The Fidai was selected not merely for physical aptitude but for reliability and ideological understanding. Training combined doctrinal education, operational skills, and logistical preparation. Early instruction emphasized Ismaili theology, including the exoteric and esoteric dimensions of doctrine, the importance of hierarchy, and the moral framework governing political action. Letters preserved in later Nizari compilations suggest that recruits studied texts detailing the Fatimid and Alamut administration, principles of obedience, and the strategic role of targeted killing within political networks. This intellectual formation was considered equally important to physical conditioning or weapon mastery, reflecting the movement's prioritization of ideological cohesion over sheer numerical strength. Practical training included instruction in stealth, observation, and infiltration. Chronicles indicate that recruits learned to move discreetly through urban and rural environments, assess target security, and execute operations with precision. Training extended to handling weapons, planning escape routes, and understanding local social and political dynamics. Archaeological surveys of Alamut and other fortresses suggest the presence of areas specifically designated for training, including secure enclosures, tactical observation points, and storage for materials required in covert operations. This infrastructure demonstrates that the Fidai system was institutionalized and systematically maintained. Ideological commitment was reinforced through hierarchical supervision and communal discipline. Fidais were closely integrated into a chain of command extending from the imam at Alamut. Supervisors provided doctrinal guidance, monitored operational readiness, and ensured adherence to prescribed protocols. Recruitment often involved an initial probationary period during which commitment was tested through obedience, secrecy, and participation in controlled exercises. Chroniclers emphasized that loyalty to the imam and to the broader network was paramount, ensuring that individual initiative did not compromise operational security or ideological coherence. The integration of ideological education and operational training served multiple functions. It maintained cohesion across geographically dispersed fortresses, mitigated the risks of defection, and ensured that each operative understood the political significance of their actions. Letters and administrative notes from later Nizari compilations indicate that fighters were briefed on the rationale behind each mission, the target's role in regional politics, and the potential consequences of failure. This combination of doctrinal comprehension and practical skill underpinned the effectiveness of the assassination system while reinforcing loyalty to the central authority at Alamut. Selection and discipline within the Fida'i system were deliberately stringent. Chroniclers report that only a small fraction of recruits completed full training, ensuring that each operative was highly reliable. This selectivity enhanced operational security and psychological impact, as even a limited number of successful actions could influence political behavior across a broad region. By emphasizing obedience and competence over numerical superiority, the Nizaris maintained a capability that was both resilient and strategically efficient. Operational deployment of fighters required careful coordination. Missions were conducted with attention to visibility, timing, and audience. Targets were often assassinated in public or semi-public spaces, reinforcing the message of deterrence. Yet these acts were executed by a single operative or a small team, ensuring control and limiting unintended consequences. Contemporary chronicles note that precision and selectivity amplified the political effect of each operation, demonstrating that the system's influence depended on strategic application rather than frequency or scale. The Fida'i system also facilitated broader administrative and intelligence functions. Recruits often gathered information, reported on the movements of hostile authorities, and supported communications between fortresses. Letters preserved in later Nizari sources suggest that Fida'i were responsible for monitoring local populations, assessing loyalties, and preparing the environment for future operations. This integration of intelligence gathering, ideological reinforcement, and selective action exemplifies the systemic sophistication of the Nizari network. By the mid-12th century, the Fida'i system had become a central institution of Nizari statecraft. Its effectiveness rested on three pillars: doctrinal indoctrination, operational proficiency, and hierarchical discipline. This model allowed the Nizaris to extend influence far beyond the numerical limits of their communities, projecting power and shaping political outcomes through carefully calculated interventions. It represents a clear example of how ideological commitment and organizational rigor can compensate for material and military constraints. Public impact depended on selective visibility. Long before Crusaders wrote about the assassins, their enemies had already defined them. The earliest portrayals of the Nizari Ismailis in Muslim historiography were overwhelmingly shaped by Sunni chroniclers of the 11th and 12th centuries. Figures such as Ibn al-Athir, al-Ghazali, and later Seljuk-aligned historians framed Nizari activity through a lens of religious and political hostility. Their accounts frequently emphasize secrecy, subversive behavior, and the alleged willingness of Ismaili agents to commit targeted killings. These narratives, however, were not impartial observations. They were produced within political contexts that favored Seljuk authority and sought to delegitimize rival actors. Analysis of these works demonstrates that polemic, rather than empirical documentation, dominated early depictions of Nizari communities. The term Hashishin illustrates this process of political labeling. Linguistic studies suggest that the label, emerging in contemporaneous Persian and Arabic sources, functioned as a delegitimizing tool rather than a descriptive category. Sunni chroniclers used it to portray the Nizaris as morally corrupt, fanatical, and externally dangerous, emphasizing supposed drug use and ritualized indoctrination. Modern scholarship, drawing on comparative textual analysis and logistical assessment, indicates that these claims were largely exaggerated or misinterpreted. The terms served to embed fear and moral condemnation into elite discourse, aligning perceptions of the Nizaris with broader efforts to stabilize Seljuk rule against a politically disruptive minority. Ibn al-Athir's chronicles provide a representative example. Writing in the early 13th century, he depicted Nizari operatives as secret killers, acting under religious fanaticism. His accounts emphasize the psychological impact on Seljuk elites, portraying the removal of governors or military commanders as evidence of Nizari audacity and supernatural resolve. Yet closer examination reveals that Ibn al-Athir rarely cited direct observation. His narratives relied on hearsay, correspondence, and prior historiography. The emphasis on moral and religious condemnation reflects the priorities of a historian embedded in Seljuk intellectual networks, highlighting the use of historiography as a vehicle for political messaging. Al-Ghazali, in both his legal and theological writings, reinforced negative portrayals of the Nizaris by situating them outside normative Sunni practice. While primarily concerned with doctrinal orthodoxy, his works also reflected contemporary anxieties regarding political stability and the enforcement of legitimate authority. He characterized Nizari activity as deliberate subversion, framing it as both morally and socially threatening. These evaluations, though ostensibly theological, were embedded in broader Seljuk political consciousness, demonstrating the intersection of ideology, historiography, and statecraft in shaping perceptions of the Nizaris. The demonization extended beyond textual description to the attribution of extraordinary capabilities. Sunni chroniclers frequently depicted Nizari operatives as capable of infiltrating fortified urban centers, influencing political decision-making, and executing acts of violence with near-mystical skill. Such portrayals amplified fear, projecting the image of a network more powerful than its material capacity would suggest. By emphasizing exceptionalized traits, chroniclers reinforced the perception that the Nizaris were a uniquely destabilizing force, further legitimizing Seljuk campaigns against them. Political considerations underpinned these narratives. Chroniclers were often patronized by Seljuk authorities or operated within intellectual environments aligned with imperial priorities. By depicting the Nizaris as threatening and morally deviant, they contributed to the broader political objective of consolidating Seljuk authority. Fear of the Nizaris became institutionalized in elite discourse, influencing military, administrative, and judicial responses. The result was a historiographical framework in which the Nizaris were defined less by their actual organizational practices and more by the political anxieties they provoked among their rivals. These narratives were also highly selective. Chroniclers emphasized incidents that demonstrated Nizari audacity or subversion while ignoring mundane aspects of community life, such as agricultural activity, trade, or internal governance. This selective reporting reinforced a one-dimensional image of the Nizaris, embedding moral and political fear in historical memory. The emphasis on secrecy, loyalty, and assassination in these sources laid the foundation for later European mythmaking, providing a pre-packaged narrative for translators, travelers, and Crusader observers. By the late 12th century, Sunni polemical narratives had solidified a cultural template for interpreting Nizari activity. Labels, anecdotes, and moral evaluations combined to produce a historiography that highlighted danger, cunning, and otherness. These accounts were absorbed by later chroniclers across the Islamic world and would eventually circulate in Europe, shaping the emerging Western imagination of the assassins. The historical Nizaris, administratively disciplined, strategically cautious, and ideologically coherent, were filtered through layers of polemic, creating a legacy that blended fact and fear. To Western observers, the assassins appeared both invisible and omnipresent. During the late 12th century, Crusader armies operating in Syria and the Levant came into direct contact with Nizari Ismaili fortresses and communities, particularly in the Jabal Bara region and along the northern Syrian mountains. Latin chroniclers, including William of Tyre, Jacques de Vitry, and later Matthew Paris, documented these encounters with varying degrees of accuracy and exaggeration. Their narratives often emphasized secrecy, sudden acts of violence, and the supposed ideological fervor of the Nizaris. However, analysis of these accounts reveals that they were frequently based on fragmented observation, second-hand reports, and cultural misunderstanding, rather than systematic investigation. William of Tyre, writing in the late 12th century, presents the Nizaris as a fearsome presence capable of infiltrating Crusader-held territories and executing high-profile targets. His descriptions, while detailed, contain inconsistencies that suggest reliance on hearsay from local informants, travelers, and other chroniclers. He emphasizes the apparent invisibility of the Nizaris, noting their ability to operate within hostile environments undetected. Archaeological and textual evidence from Syrian fortresses indicates that Nizari operatives were highly disciplined and strategically positioned, which may have contributed to this perception of omnipresence. Yet William's account amplifies the effect into a narrative of omnipotence, conflating operational efficiency with legend. Jacques de Vitry, writing in the early 13th century, further transmitted tales of the Nizari's purported rituals and training. His work, aimed at a European audience unfamiliar with Ismaili doctrine, emphasizes secrecy and extreme loyalty, often framing the Nizaris as agents of moral and spiritual danger. Modern historians note that de Vitry's writings reflect the interpretive lens of Latin Christendom, in which Muslim actors were frequently understood through tropes of otherness and supernatural threat. The result was a textual transformation. Practical, disciplined political actors became exoticized, and their operational strategies were interpreted as irrational fanaticism or occult manipulation. The Latin transmission of Nizari activity relied heavily on analogy and literary convention. Chroniclers drew comparisons to familiar European social and religious models, often inferring ritualized initiation, esoteric practices, and moral corruption where none existed. Linguistic analysis suggests that terms such as assassini were derived indirectly from Arabic sources, particularly polemical Sunni accounts, and transmitted through Crusader informants. This process compounded errors and exaggeration, embedding fear and sensationalism into Western historiography. What was originally a politically rational system of small-scale, targeted interventions became a narrative of omnipresent, secretive agents capable of extraordinary violence. Eyewitness interaction was limited. Crusaders rarely observed the operational inner workings of Nizari fortresses or the structure of the Fidei system. Most reports were based on attacks, defensive measures, or intelligence from local populations, filtered through linguistic and cultural barriers. Chroniclers interpreted these observations using familiar European categories, projecting motifs of secrecy, danger, and heresy onto the Nizaris. The visual and operational discipline of Nizari communities, fortress isolation, disciplined agents, and controlled communication, was thus misread as mysticism, fanaticism, or supernatural skill. Despite these distortions, fragments of accurate observation survive. European chroniclers note the strategic locations of fortresses, the ability of Nizari operatives to evade capture, and the coordination of defensive actions. These descriptions, corroborated by archaeological studies at Masyaf and Abu Kubis, indicate that Crusaders recognized the effectiveness of Nizari military and administrative organization, even if they misunderstood its ideological and operational context. The combination of factual observation and interpretive exaggeration produced a hybrid record, partially accurate, partially sensationalized, and increasingly mythologized as it circulated through Latin Europe. The process of narrative transformation continued as Crusader reports were copied, translated, and incorporated into later European chronicles. Second-hand stories about stealth, obedience, and targeted killing were abstracted from their Near Eastern context and merged with pre-existing ideas of heresy, secret societies, and exotic religious practices. The resulting narrative portrayed the assassins as omnipotent agents capable of infiltrating courts and striking elites with impunity. Scholars today identify this as the foundation of the enduring assassin legend in Western imagination, a legend rooted in selective observation, linguistic misinterpretation, and cultural projection. By the early 13th century, European perceptions of the Nizaris had solidified. Crusader accounts transmitted through Latin sources emphasized secrecy, lethality, and ideological extremity. These accounts, though containing kernels of truth regarding operational skill and fortress strategy, systematically amplified fear and moral panic. The factual Nizari practices, targeted political killing, disciplined hierarchies, and fortress networks, were filtered through layers of misinterpretation, resulting in narratives that emphasized the invisible, omnipresent threat. Second-hand stories would soon become foundational myths. The assassin state governed without borders. Following the consolidation of Alamut and the expansion of fortress networks across Persia and Syria, the Nizaris developed an administrative system capable of maintaining cohesion over geographically dispersed and politically isolated communities. Medieval Persian chronicles, including Juwayni's Tariq-i-Jahangasheh and later Nizari compilations, describe a hierarchical structure centered on the imam at Alamut. Authority radiated outward through a chain of dayas, fortress commanders, and subordinate officials, allowing centralized decision-making without direct territorial dominion. This system relied on personal loyalty, ideological commitment, and disciplined adherence to codified protocols. At the apex of governance stood the imam, whose authority was both spiritual and operational. Letters and administrative documents preserved in later Nizari collections indicate that the imam issued directives on doctrinal matters, military operations, and fortress management. These communications were transmitted to regional dawahs and local commanders, who interpreted instructions in accordance with local conditions while preserving centralized objectives. This dual system of oversight and localized discretion enabled the Nizaris to maintain operational flexibility while ensuring coherence across multiple fortresses. Dawahs functioned as both ideological officers and administrative intermediaries. They supervised recruitment, doctrinal education, and the ideological instruction of fidawis, while also overseeing logistical matters within individual fortresses. Chroniclers note that dawahs monitored garrison loyalty, coordinated resource allocation, and reported intelligence to central authority. Archaeological evidence from Alamut and Lamsar supports the presence of administrative quarters and archival spaces, suggesting that dawahs maintained records of personnel, supplies, and correspondence, reinforcing systematic governance despite spatial limitations. Fortress commanders managed day-to-day military and civic operations. Their responsibilities included maintaining defensive readiness, organizing patrols, and supervising labor for maintenance, fortification, and agricultural production. Textual sources indicate that commanders were selected for loyalty, intelligence, and operational competence rather than lineage or local influence, reflecting a meritocratic approach adapted to the challenges of survival under hostile conditions. Supervisors maintained discipline through regular inspection, hierarchical accountability, and alignment with the imam's directives. Local officials managed logistical and civic functions, including food distribution, water supply, and construction projects within and surrounding the fortresses. Excavations at Girdku and Masyaf reveal cistern systems, terrace storage facilities, and domestic quarters that required careful planning and supervision. Archaeological traces of roads, stairways, and controlled access points further suggest that fortresses were internally organized to optimize movement, resource allocation, and security. These structural measures indicate the presence of a formalized administrative framework capable of sustaining both population and operations over extended periods. The hierarchical system functioned through a combination of direct oversight and delegated authority. While the imam and central dawahs provided ideological and strategic guidance, local commanders adapted policies to the realities of geography, population, and threat environment. This decentralized execution ensured responsiveness to immediate conditions while maintaining alignment with overarching objectives. Letters preserved in Nizari archives emphasize reporting, accountability, and operational documentation as critical mechanisms for sustaining coherence across dispersed sites. The Nizari administrative model demonstrates the integration of ideology and practical governance. Administrative officers were trained in both doctrinal understanding and operational management, ensuring that political and spiritual objectives were mutually reinforcing. Fortresses were not merely military outposts but functioning centers of governance, logistics, and intelligence, capable of sustaining populations, coordinating defensive action, and implementing strategic directives. Despite the absence of large territorial holdings, this system allowed the Nizaris to exercise control over a network that spanned hundreds of kilometers. Fortresses operated as semi-autonomous nodes, yet all were interlinked through communication channels, standardized protocols, and shared loyalty to the imam. This state without borders model illustrates how political systems can adapt to structural constraints, leveraging ideological authority, hierarchical discipline, and local administration to maintain stability and influence in hostile environments. Administration required sustainable economic foundations. Isolation forced efficiency. The economic foundation of the Nizari fortress network was closely tied to the constraints and opportunities of mountainous terrain. Fortresses such as Alamut, Lamsar, and those in Quistan were often located on ridgelines or plateaus with limited arable land, necessitating innovative approaches to agriculture, irrigation, and resource management. Environmental archaeological studies indicate the presence of terraced fields, cisterns, and channels designed to maximize water retention and soil productivity. These systems enabled the fortresses to sustain relatively dense populations over extended periods without relying solely on external supply lines. Agriculture within these fortresses focused on staple crops, orchards, and small-scale livestock husbandry. Cereals, legumes, and fruit trees were cultivated on terraced plots that minimized erosion and utilized available water efficiently. Archaeobotanical evidence from Alamut demonstrates careful crop rotation and the integration of perennial and annual crops, reflecting an understanding of local microclimates and soil conditions. Livestock, including goats and sheep, supplemented plant-based production, providing protein, wool, and labor. This combination of agricultural strategies allowed fortress populations to remain resilient during periods of siege or political disruption. Taxation supplemented local production and provided resources for administrative and military operations. Contemporary accounts and later Nizari documents indicate that fortresses collected levies from surrounding communities, often in the form of in-kind contributions rather than cash. These contributions supported garrison maintenance, fortress construction, and the distribution of supplies to dayas and faidoas. Records suggest that taxation was structured to balance sustainability with operational requirements, avoiding overexploitation that could undermine loyalty or long-term productivity. Administrative oversight ensured equitable collection and minimized disputes, reflecting a sophisticated understanding of resource governance in a politically constrained environment. The economic system was closely integrated with fortress design. Cisterns and water channels supplied both agriculture and domestic needs, allowing for storage of surplus during dry periods. Excavations at Lamsar reveal extensive cistern networks capable of maintaining water supply for months, while terraced fields extended cultivation across steep slopes. Roadways, stairs, and defensive gates were designed to facilitate transport of goods while maintaining security. This integration of architecture, agriculture, and administration ensured that economic self-sufficiency supported both day-to-day life and military readiness. Surplus production was managed carefully to ensure both operational flexibility and resilience against sieges. Grain, oil, and other essentials were stored in secured granaries within fortresses, allowing commanders to ration supplies during periods of external threat. Livestock were maintained on terraces or in corrals, and fodder was carefully stockpiled. These practices highlight the strategic importance of resource management as a component of governance, demonstrating that economic considerations were inseparable from military and administrative planning. Trade supplemented local production where feasible. While fortresses were often isolated, chroniclers note exchanges with nearby villages and regional markets for goods such as textiles, metalwork, and luxury items. These interactions were regulated to maintain security and ideological oversight. Letters and administrative notes indicate that dayas oversaw trade relationships, ensuring that economic activity reinforced both logistical needs and political control. This controlled commerce allowed fortresses to acquire materials beyond local production without undermining defensive capabilities or ideological cohesion. The integration of agriculture, taxation, and trade supported broader Nizari objectives. Economic stability enabled the sustenance of fortress populations, the operational readiness of Fidai operatives, and the maintenance of administrative networks. It also provided resources for doctrinal instruction and ideological dissemination, allowing the community to preserve intellectual continuity even under conditions of political hostility. In this way, the economic system underpinned both survival and strategic capability, demonstrating the practical realism behind the Nizari's endurance. By the early 13th century, the combination of efficient mountain agriculture, structured taxation, and controlled trade had produced a resilient economic foundation for the Nizari state. The success of these measures highlights how isolation and resource scarcity shaped innovative governance strategies. Each fortress functioned as a largely self-sufficient economic unit, integrated into a broader network capable of sustaining both administrative and military operations over decades. Economic stability supported intellectual continuity. In the Crusader era, neutrality was often the most aggressive strategy. By the late 11th and early 12th centuries, the Levant was characterized by a complex mosaic of political authorities. Crusader states such as the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem coexisted alongside Muslim polities, including the Seljuk Emirates, the Zengid domains, and, later, the Ayyubid Sultanate. This fragmentation created both vulnerability and opportunity for the Nizari Ismailis, whose Syrian fortresses were relatively small and militarily limited compared with surrounding powers. To maintain survival, the Nizaris relied on a strategy of cautious engagement, balancing diplomacy, selective confrontation, and ideological discretion. Nizari leaders prioritized operational security over large-scale political alignment. Contemporary accounts, including those of Ibn al-Qalanisi and William of Tyre, indicate that Nizari fortresses cultivated relationships with multiple neighboring powers, providing intelligence, offering non-aggression assurances, or paying tribute where advantageous. This approach was not neutral in the sense of passivity. Rather, it was a deliberate strategy to maximize autonomy and preserve the integrity of fortress communities in a volatile environment. By avoiding formal alliances, the Nizaris retained freedom of action while limiting the risk of being drawn into external conflicts. Diplomatic interactions were highly context-dependent. In Aleppo and the northern Syrian mountains, local Nizari leaders engaged with Seljuk officials, Crusader representatives, and regional emirs according to immediate circumstances. Letters and chronicles describe temporary truces, negotiated safe passages, and agreements to respect fortress autonomy. These arrangements were often reinforced through personal bonds, hostages, or ritualized oaths, demonstrating the integration of conventional diplomacy into a broader system of political survival. Such measures allowed Nizari fortresses to persist amidst forces that were numerically and militarily superior. Selective violence complemented diplomacy. While maintaining a posture of relative neutrality, Nizari fighters executed targeted operations against figures deemed threats to fortress security or community survival. Contemporary chronicles note instances in which governors, military commanders, or political agents who threatened Nizari enclaves were removed, reinforcing the perception of Nizari reach without provoking open warfare. The dual strategy of cautious negotiation and selective intervention created a balance that discouraged aggression from larger powers while maintaining credibility and deterrent capacity. The strategic approach also reflected recognition of logistical limitations. Syrian fortresses were isolated and reliant on local resources and controlled trade. Open military confrontation would have endangered populations and disrupted economic systems supporting the fortresses. Maintaining autonomy required careful calibration of interactions with all surrounding actors, emphasizing intelligence gathering, situational awareness, and restrained application of force. Letters preserved in later Nizari archives underscore the emphasis on timing, target selection, and operational secrecy, reflecting a methodical approach to political engagement. Ideological discretion was integral to survival. Nizari communities avoided overtly aligning with either Crusader or Muslim factions, reducing the risk of retaliation motivated by sectarian or political hostility. Contemporary chronicles suggest that neighboring rulers often understood Nizari neutrality pragmatically. Their objective was stability and continuity rather than expansion or conquest. This ideological flexibility did not undermine cohesion within the movement. Rather, it reinforced centralized authority by subordinating opportunistic engagement to strategic goals determined at Alamut. The fragmented Levantine landscape necessitated adaptive intelligence networks. Fortresses maintained observation posts, established local informants, and monitored movements of rival powers. By collecting and analyzing political, military, and social information, Nizari leaders could anticipate threats, negotiate with precision, and deploy fighters selectively. Archaeological surveys of Syrian fortresses, including Masyaf and Abu Kubris, reveal structures designed for surveillance and secure communication, demonstrating that the intelligence apparatus was integral to strategic decision-making. By the mid-12th century, this combination of diplomatic ambiguity, selective violence, and intelligence gathering had become the defining feature of Nizari Syrian strategy. Fortresses were able to maintain autonomy, preserve operational capacity, and continue ideological and administrative activity despite the pressures of Crusader expansion and Muslim consolidation. Contemporary chroniclers' accounts of Nizari activity often emphasize fear and unpredictability, reflecting the effectiveness of the strategy in projecting influence disproportionate to the numerical or military size of the community. Selective violence reinforced political autonomy. Every assassination carried a political message. Nizari operations in the Levant during the 12th century combined targeted violence with strategic diplomacy, demonstrating that assassination functioned as a deliberate instrument of statecraft. Chroniclers describe interactions with both Crusader and Muslim leaders, most notably Saladin, the Ayyubid Sultan, and Raymond II of Tripoli. While European and Muslim sources often exaggerate or mythologize events, careful analysis allows identification of verified incidents and the political logic underlying them. Each act of violence was designed to influence behavior, reinforce autonomy, and shape negotiations rather than serve indiscriminate vengeance. The case of Raymond II of Tripoli illustrates the strategic function of targeted assassination. In 1152 CE, Raymond was killed within his own fortress under circumstances attributed to Nizari operatives. Contemporary Latin chronicles note the operation's precision and timing, suggesting careful planning rather than spontaneous action. The act effectively conveyed a political message. Interference with Nizari settlements or Dawa networks carried immediate consequences. Similar patterns are evident in interactions with Muslim leaders, where removal of hostile governors or emissaries produced measurable shifts in local policy toward Nizari fortresses, often prompting truces or concessions. Relations with Saladin highlight the integration of diplomacy and selective violence. Saladin's consolidation of Muslim territories in Syria and Egypt placed him in contact with Nizari fortresses. Contemporary chroniclers report attempts at negotiation, tribute exchanges, and intelligence sharing that allowed fortresses such as Masyaf to maintain autonomy. While later legends emphasize dramatic assassination plots against Saladin himself, primary sources suggest that operations focused on local officials and military agents threatening Nizari security rather than the Sultan directly. The combination of strategic restraint and symbolic action reinforced both deterrence and cooperative engagement. Nizari agents were chosen for ideological commitment, operational discipline, and tactical competence, ensuring that actions reflected strategic intent. Letters and administrative notes preserved in later compilations indicate that targets were carefully selected based on political significance, proximity to fortress interests, and potential to influence broader power dynamics. This disciplined approach underscores that assassination was not random or purely symbolic. It functioned as a form of calibrated diplomacy, communicating authority, warning adversaries, and preserving independence. Documentation of operations demonstrates systematic planning. Chronicles note reconnaissance, surveillance, and intelligence gathering preceding high-profile killings. Operatives were trained to observe routines, exploit vulnerabilities, and execute missions with minimal collateral disruption. In some cases, the FIDO-I system ensured that missions were carried out openly, providing witnesses who understood the political context and thereby amplifying the message. These measures enhanced the deterrent effect, signaling the capability and reach of the Nizari network without provoking unnecessary conflict. Diplomatic engagement complemented selective action. Treaties, negotiated truces, and local agreements were regularly employed to avoid unnecessary confrontation with larger powers. Fortresses offered tribute or temporary safe conduct in exchange for autonomy, integrating assassination into a broader strategy of political leverage rather than indiscriminate violence. Contemporary sources highlight instances in which Crusader and Muslim rulers adjusted policies toward fortresses following an operation, demonstrating the effectiveness of combining violence with negotiation to maintain security and influence. Historical analysis emphasizes the contrast between verified events and later legend. Medieval chroniclers, particularly in Europe, exaggerated the dramatic and secretive aspects of Nizari activity, attributing almost supernatural abilities to operatives and overemphasizing plots against major rulers. Archaeological evidence and careful reading of contemporary Syrian and Crusader chronicles suggest that most operations were small-scale, targeted, and contextually rational, aimed at specific threats rather than broad ideological destruction. Recognizing this distinction allows a clearer understanding of Nizari strategy as a rational, calculated form of political diplomacy embedded within their broader defensive and administrative framework. By systematically applying selective violence alongside negotiation, tribute, and intelligence gathering, the Nizaris in Syria were able to maintain autonomy despite the presence of militarily superior powers. Each assassination carried a political message that reinforced deterrence, signaled authority, and preserved strategic freedom. This integration of operational precision, ideological discipline, and diplomatic engagement illustrates the adaptability and resilience of the Nizari state in a volatile environment. Long-term survival depended on internal cohesion. Revolutionary systems face their greatest test after the founder dies. Hassan I Sabbah's death in 1124 CE marked a pivotal moment for the Nizari Ismaili movement. Having established Alamut as the ideological and operational center of the state, Hassan had created a disciplined administrative network and an effective Fido-I system. The continuity of the movement depended on the mechanisms he put in place for succession, which were designed to preserve centralized authority while ensuring operational stability across dispersed fortresses. Contemporary chronicles, including Juwayni's Tariq-i-Jahangishay and later Nizari compilations, indicate that Hassan's successors were carefully selected for loyalty, doctrinal understanding, and administrative competence. The first leadership transition illustrates the institutional durability of the Nizari state. Authority passed to Kia Bujargumid, a close associate of Hassan, who had served as commander of Alamut's garrison and had been deeply involved in the administration of the fortress network. Bujargumid's appointment was formalized through both personal allegiance to the imam and recognition by key dawis and commanders, ensuring continuity of command. Letters preserved in Nizari compilations suggest that this transition was largely uncontested, reflecting the effectiveness of Hassan's system in integrating hierarchy, loyalty, and operational authority. Under Bujargumid, governance structures established by Hassan were maintained, including the hierarchical chain of da'is, operational oversight of Fidois, and administrative protocols within fortresses. Historians note that minor adjustments were made to reflect evolving political conditions, particularly in Syria, where Nizari communities faced new threats from Crusader states and regional Muslim rulers. The emphasis on meritocratic selection and centralized doctrinal guidance allowed leadership to respond effectively to these challenges without disrupting the overall cohesion of the network. Succession mechanisms relied heavily on institutionalized communication and codified directives. Bujargumid continued to issue instructions to subordinate dawis and commanders, maintaining the ideological coherence that had underpinned Hassan's administration. Documents preserved in later Nizari compilations emphasize reporting, accountability, and compliance with central authority as critical tools for preventing fragmentation. By maintaining these protocols, the Nizaris ensured that operational practices, fortress management, and political strategy remained consistent despite changes in leadership. Leadership continuity was reinforced through the integration of ideology and governance. The central figure of the imam remained the source of spiritual and operational authority, providing a unifying principle for decision-making. Doctrinal instruction, administrative guidance, and operational planning were closely intertwined, ensuring that new leaders adhered to the principles established under Hassan. This model minimized the risk of opportunistic factionalism, demonstrating that ideological cohesion could stabilize political authority even in a geographically dispersed and militarily constrained environment. The transition also involved careful management of symbolic and practical authority. Fortresses and regional agents recognized the successor not only through formal appointment, but also through adherence to established operational and doctrinal procedures. This dual reinforcement of legitimacy, both procedural and relational, enabled Bujargumid to assert authority effectively across multiple fortresses. Chronicles suggest that local commanders and da'is were expected to demonstrate loyalty through both obedience and active engagement in the operational, administrative, and doctrinal objectives of the state. Despite these measures, the succession period required vigilance. External threats from Seljuks, Crusaders, and rival Muslim authorities continued to challenge the Nizari network, and any perceived weakness could invite aggression. Bujargumid's leadership emphasized discipline, intelligence gathering, and calculated intervention, ensuring that the operational integrity of the fortresses was preserved. The ability to maintain centralized control without large territorial holdings underscores the robustness of the systems Hassan had established. This first post-Hassan leadership phase demonstrates that the Nizari state was more than the personal authority of a charismatic founder. By institutionalizing hierarchy, administrative protocols, and doctrinal coherence, Hassan I Sabbah had created a resilient framework capable of absorbing leadership transitions without destabilizing the network. The successful implementation of succession reinforced the perception of Nizari fortresses as enduring centers of governance, ideology, and military capability. Doctrinal shifts soon followed. The assassins briefly abandoned secrecy. In 1164 CE, under the leadership of Imam Hassan II, the Nizari Ismaili community in Persia underwent a significant doctrinal transformation marked by the declaration of the Qiyamah, or spiritual resurrection. Primary Persian texts and later Nizari compilations describe this event as a public assertion that the inner, esoteric meaning of the faith had been revealed, temporarily superseding the requirement for strict concealment of the Imam's authority. The declaration represented both a theological milestone and a practical statement of centralized authority, signaling a shift in internal practice and communal identity after decades of operating largely in secrecy. The Qiyamah Declaration functioned on multiple levels. Doctrinally, it emphasized the primacy of spiritual understanding, batin, over the exoteric, zahir, allowing followers to interpret religious law with reference to the guidance of the Imam rather than strict textual adherence alone. Persian treatises from the period indicate that Hassan II instructed dawis and community leaders to communicate this understanding within fortress networks, creating a temporarily more transparent hierarchy. This shift reinforced the Imam's central authority, transforming the community's internal structure by granting greater latitude to interpretive officials while maintaining doctrinal coherence. Operationally, the declaration required adjustments within the fortress system. Fortresses that had previously emphasized concealment and security now functioned as centers for doctrinal instruction, debate, and communal observance. Chronicles describe gatherings at Alamut and other major fortresses in which followers were instructed in the esoteric principles of the faith, highlighting the dual focus on spiritual renewal and administrative coordination. Archaeological evidence, including expanded domestic and communal spaces in Alamut, supports the existence of facilities capable of supporting such organized activity. The Qiyamah also had significant political implications. By momentarily relaxing the requirement for secrecy, Hassan II asserted the independence of the Nizari state and the supremacy of the Imam's authority within the community. The declaration can be understood as both an ideological consolidation and a form of political signaling. It communicated to followers and adversaries alike that the Imam's guidance was absolute, and that the community's cohesion rested on adherence to a revealed spiritual framework. This served to reinforce loyalty, centralize authority, and stabilize operations across dispersed fortresses. Contemporary Persian accounts indicate that the Qiyamah was carefully framed to balance doctrinal innovation with operational security. While secrecy was temporarily reduced, the declaration was confined to trusted community members and conducted under controlled circumstances. By limiting dissemination to inner circles, Hassan II mitigated the risk of external exploitation while still achieving internal consolidation. This measured approach reflects the ongoing integration of ideology and practical governance that had characterized Nizari administration since Hassan I Sabbah. The declaration also catalyzed internal debate. Doctrinal change required adjustment in the understanding and behavior of dais, commanders, and other officials. Letters and later compilations indicate instructions emphasizing discipline, proper dissemination of teachings, and the maintenance of ritual and administrative routines. The Qiyamah did not dismantle existing structures. Instead, it overlaid a new interpretive framework that reinforced the Imam's authority and aligned spiritual and operational priorities. The event illustrates how the Nizari community combined theological evolution with practical governance to maintain cohesion and resilience. Despite these measures, the Qiyamah provoked reactions beyond the community. Neighboring Seljuk authorities and regional actors interpreted the declaration as a potential threat to social and political norms, particularly given the Nizari's history of strategic violence and autonomous administration. Persian chronicles suggest that local opposition, coupled with the broader political environment, prompted Hassan II to adjust practices after a period of heightened visibility. These adjustments illustrate the dynamic balance between doctrinal assertion and external political realities, demonstrating the continued importance of strategic discretion in sustaining the state. By situating spiritual leadership at the center of both doctrinal and administrative authority, the Qiyamah period highlighted the capacity of the Nizari state to integrate theological innovation with operational governance. The temporary relaxation of secrecy allowed for consolidation of internal loyalty, clarification of hierarchies, and reinforcement of the imam's central role. This doctrinal evolution was both a milestone in ideological history and a practical exercise in statecraft. Reversal followed regional backlash. The Mongols confronted the assassins without fear. By the mid-13th century, the political landscape of Iran and the broader Middle East had been radically transformed. The Abbasid Caliphate had weakened, leaving fragmented Seljuk and local dynasties vulnerable to external incursions. Into this environment entered the Mongol armies of Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, who was tasked with consolidating Mongol authority in the region and subduing all resistant powers. Contemporary Persian chronicles, including Javani's Tariq-i-Jahangasheh, provide detailed accounts of these campaigns, contextualizing the Mongol advance as part of a broader strategy of systematic conquest and centralized control. Hulagu's forces employed large-scale siege warfare, advanced engineering, and psychological intimidation to achieve rapid territorial gains. The Mongol army, structured into disciplined units capable of coordinated movement over diverse terrain, approached Iran with logistical efficiency and overwhelming numbers. Historical accounts note that fortresses which had resisted conventional regional powers for decades, sometimes centuries, were often captured with relative speed, reflecting the scale and sophistication of Mongol military organization. This presented a strategic challenge unlike any previously faced by the Nizari fortresses. The Nizari Ismailis had long relied on the combination of secrecy, fortified strongholds, and targeted assassination to deter or eliminate threats. In Persia, this system had successfully defended fortresses such as Alamut, Lamsar, and Girdku against Seljuk and regional forces. However, the Mongol approach rendered these methods insufficient. Contemporary sources indicate that Mongol commanders understood the psychological and symbolic power of fortresses and planned operations that neutralized their strategic advantages. Standard assassination attempts could not penetrate the scale, coordination, and speed of Mongol advances, revealing the limits of the Nizari deterrence model. Mongol expansion was facilitated by intelligence networks, rapid communication, and the integration of engineers capable of undermining fortifications. Archaeological studies of sites associated with Mongol sieges suggest that heavy siege engines, catapults, and scaling techniques were deployed systematically to overcome natural and man-made defenses. Accounts describe coordinated assaults designed to isolate each fortress, cutting off supply routes and compelling surrender. The scale of the Mongol threat required adaptation, yet the Nizari network, despite its resilience and discipline, faced structural limits in responding to such overwhelming force. Hulagu's campaign also had significant political dimensions. The Mongols sought to eliminate all autonomous actors in Iran to secure lines of communication and consolidate administrative control. The Nizari fortresses, as centers of autonomous authority, represented both symbolic and practical obstacles. Javani's narrative emphasizes that the Mongols approached these targets methodically, combining direct military action with offers of submission to test the resolve and cohesion of fortress communities. This strategic calculus underlined the shift from localized military conflict to state-scale warfare, confronting the Nizaris with an existential challenge. The context of Abbasid decline further amplified the impact of Mongol expansion. The inability of regional Muslim powers to provide coordinated resistance left isolated polities vulnerable. Historical sources describe the collapse of Seljuk-aligned defenses and the rapid Mongol occupation of key Iranian cities, which limited the Nizari's ability to mobilize alliances or negotiate external support. The combination of political fragmentation, military innovation, and overwhelming force placed Alamut and other fortresses in a situation unprecedented in their history. The Mongol approach tested both the physical and administrative structures of the Nizari state. Fortresses that had successfully resisted sieges and coordinated defense for decades faced new challenges in logistics, communication, and morale under sustained Mongol pressure. Letters and accounts from surviving chroniclers suggest that strategic assessment and resource allocation became critical, yet the sheer scale of the Mongol army and its engineering capabilities rendered conventional defensive methods insufficient. By the early 1250s, Mongol forces were positioned to strike at the heart of Nizari Persia. Their combination of numerical superiority, siege technology, and coordinated campaign planning confronted the assassins with an unprecedented threat, demonstrating that the combination of secrecy, targeted killing, and fortress defense could no longer guarantee survival against a fully mobilized imperial force. The operational and psychological environment created by Mongol expansion marked the end of the Nizaris' traditional defensive paradigm. Alamut faced unprecedented siege warfare. A century of survival ended without resistance. In 1256 CE, Alamut, the symbolic and operational center of the Nizari Ismailis state, fell to the Mongol forces of Hulagu Khan. Contemporary Persian chronicles, including Javani's Tariq-i-Jahangasheh, describe the systematic approach employed by the Mongols to subdue the fortress. Unlike many historical portrayals that emphasize heroic last stands or dramatic combat, the evidence indicates that Alamut was surrendered largely without violent resistance, reflecting both strategic calculation by the Nizaris and the overwhelming strength of the Mongol campaign. The decision to capitulate was influenced by multiple factors. The Mongols had already captured surrounding fortresses, isolating Alamut and cutting off logistical support. Supply lines were disrupted, and the garrison faced the prospect of prolonged siege against an adversary capable of sustained, heavy engineering operations. Archaeological evidence and textual records suggest that the Nizari leadership, following established administrative and ideological protocols, prioritized the preservation of lives and institutional knowledge over futile military confrontation. The surrender of Alamut exemplifies a rational adaptation to strategic impossibility. Upon occupation, Hulagu's forces systematically destroyed fortifications, dismantled infrastructure, and removed any potential for immediate Nizari military recovery. Accounts note the demolition of defensive walls, gates, and towers, as well as the looting of storage facilities. Persian chroniclers emphasize that the destruction was intended to prevent Alamut from serving as a future operational or symbolic center, underscoring the Mongols' methodical approach to eliminating autonomous centers of power. The systematic nature of the destruction contrasts with the dramatized narratives of violent resistance found in later European accounts. The fate of the Nizari library at Alamut illustrates the cultural and intellectual consequences of the Mongol conquest. Texts preserved or copied from earlier Ismaili compilations were largely dispersed or destroyed during the fall. Manuscripts, administrative records, and doctrinal treatises were either seized, burned, or lost, representing a significant disruption in the transmission of community knowledge. Later Persian sources note the loss of specialized esoteric texts, highlighting the vulnerability of intellectual infrastructure when tied to a single territorial locus. This event underscores the broader impact of military conquest on institutional continuity and cultural memory. Leadership decisions during the siege also reflected continuity with Nizari operational principles. Rather than exposing personnel to likely death, the imam and senior dais negotiated terms that preserved the lives of key figures and allowed for the eventual relocation of surviving members. Chroniclers indicate that strategic relocation and preservation of personnel were prioritized, ensuring that the community could endure as a social and religious entity, even in the absence of territorial control. This approach exemplifies the adaptability of Nizari governance under extreme external pressure. The Mongol conquest also affected neighboring regions and powers. The fall of Alamut sent a clear signal to remaining independent fortresses, compelling submission or alignment with Mongol authority. Persian and Mongol sources describe coordinated campaigns targeting secondary fortresses, effectively dismantling the territorial infrastructure of the Nizari state. While isolated strongholds continued to operate for a time, the centralized organizational model of Alamut was irreparably disrupted, marking the end of the Nizari's era of territorial autonomy in Persia. Importantly, the fall of Alamut corrects misconceptions perpetuated in later historiography and popular culture. European narratives frequently romanticized the Nizari's last moments, depicting dramatic, almost mythical resistance. Contemporary Persian sources, however, emphasize strategic surrender, resource preservation, and the prioritization of continuity over combat. This perspective demonstrates that the Nizari leadership valued survival and institutional resilience above martial spectacle, adhering to rational principles even under extreme duress. By the conclusion of the 1256 campaign, Alamut was effectively neutralized as a fortress, its infrastructure dismantled, and its library dispersed. The physical destruction did not, however, extinguish the Nizari Ismaili community. Surviving members relocated to secondary fortresses, remote villages, and mountain refuges, preserving both doctrine and administrative knowledge. The fall of Alamut marked the transformation of the Nizaris from a territorial polity into a primarily ideological and social network, capable of maintaining identity and continuity without centralized territory. Survival shifted from territory to identity. The assassins did not disappear, they adapted. The Mongol destruction of Alamut in 1256 CE marked the end of the Nizari Ismailis' territorial state, yet it did not extinguish the community. Surviving members dispersed across Persia, Central Asia, and parts of South Asia, maintaining doctrinal cohesion while avoiding the attention of dominant powers. Contemporary chronicles and later Nizari compilations describe a pattern of strategic relocation, emphasizing mountainous and remote areas that provided natural defenses, continuity of social networks, and opportunities for clandestine practice. These settlements allowed the community to preserve institutional knowledge, doctrinal instruction, and administrative protocols despite the absence of centralized fortresses. Secondary fortresses and smaller strongholds became focal points for continuity. Sites such as Girdku, Rudbar, and regions in the Alborz Mountains offered physical protection, while facilitating the ongoing role of dayas and local commanders. Archaeological surveys reveal that these locations were maintained as defensive and residential centers, albeit on a reduced scale compared with Alamut. This decentralization represented a deliberate strategy. By dispersing, the community reduced vulnerability to further large-scale military campaigns while retaining the capacity to coordinate doctrinal and administrative activities internally. The Nizari community also adapted through integration with local populations. Textual evidence indicates that members engaged in trade, agriculture, and local governance in a manner consistent with social norms while maintaining distinct religious identity. This approach allowed for survival under political regimes that were often hostile or indifferent. By blending invisibility with discrete influence, the Nizaris sustained their religious and organizational structures without provoking direct confrontation. Letters and administrative notes preserved in later compilations suggest that communication and training remained tightly controlled, ensuring continuity across dispersed settlements. Migration extended beyond Persia. Historical sources trace Nizari movements into Central Asia, including regions of modern Afghanistan and northern Iran, as well as into parts of South Asia, notably areas corresponding to present-day India and Pakistan. In these locations, communities continued to practice the faith clandestinely, often under the guise of broader local populations. This pattern of survival demonstrates the flexibility of organizational structures established during the Alamut period, emphasizing adaptability over territorial control as a key to long-term endurance. The emphasis on internal cohesion and doctrinal fidelity allowed the community to maintain identity despite the absence of formal state structures. Surviving dawahs continued to instruct adherents, coordinate dispersed networks, and uphold ritual and doctrinal standards. Persian compilations describe protocols for succession, administration, and religious instruction that mirrored earlier Alamut practices, albeit adapted to conditions of dispersal and concealment. By retaining hierarchical and ideological frameworks, the Nizaris ensured continuity of authority and preserved the integrity of the faith across generations. Economic adaptation was also critical. Dispersed communities relied on localized agriculture, trade, and artisanal activity to sustain themselves. Unlike the centralized fortress economy, these networks were flexible, diversified, and integrated with local markets while maintaining insular communal oversight. The combination of economic resilience, doctrinal continuity, and strategic concealment allowed the Nizaris to survive periods of political instability, persecution, and social marginalization. The survival of the community laid the foundation for later historical perception and cultural memory. Accounts of the Nizaris' continued existence, though often fragmented, ensured that the name and reputation of the assassins endured, providing a basis for both scholarly study and popular legend. By prioritizing adaptation and cohesion over confrontation, the Nizaris preserved not only religious practice but also a distinct social and organizational identity that would influence subsequent generations. The transition from territorial polity to dispersed, clandestine network underscores the adaptability of the Nizari state. By the late 13th century, the assassins had shifted focus from fortress defense to community resilience, intellectual continuity, and discrete influence within regional societies. This transformation allowed the movement to survive external pressures while maintaining the institutional structures, doctrinal principles, and hierarchical systems established during the Alamut era. Legacy would be shaped by outsiders. Fiction preserved what history corrected. The Nizari Ismailis' historical legacy has often been filtered through layers of myth, legend, and cultural imagination. European travelers, chroniclers, and later Enlightenment historians frequently emphasized secrecy, fanaticism, and dramatic assassinations, creating a distorted image that persisted into modern popular culture. Works by figures such as Marco Polo, who relayed second-hand accounts of the Hashishin, emphasized exoticism and danger rather than factual reporting. Orientalist scholarship of the 18th and 19th centuries further amplified these narratives, framing the Nizaris as a mysterious and violent sect emblematic of the otherness of the Islamic world. The proliferation of the assassin myth in literature, art, and media illustrates how narrative appeal often overshadowed historical accuracy. Early modern histories presented the assassins as archetypal figures of stealth and intrigue, contributing to sensationalized accounts in European chronicles and subsequent fiction. These accounts frequently conflated events across centuries, misattributed actions to the Nizaris, and neglected the strategic and political rationales behind their operations. For example, depictions of near-supernatural Fida-I operatives were literary constructions, rather than reflections of documented operational practices in Persian and Syrian fortresses. Historiographical distortions were compounded by the selective survival of sources. Sunni polemical texts and Crusader chronicles emphasized the assassins' threats to rulers, often exaggerating scale and intent. European scholars later relied on these sources without contextual analysis, embedding the image of the Nizaris as violent, secretive extremists into broader historical narratives. By contrast, Persian texts, Nizari compilations, and archaeological evidence present a more nuanced understanding. Targeted killings were limited in scale, ideologically grounded, and subordinated to political strategy rather than indiscriminate terror. Modern popular culture has continued this pattern, drawing inspiration from medieval legends to create fictionalized portrayals of the assassins in novels, films, and video games. While these works often maintain elements of historical reference, such as mountain fortresses and clandestine operatives, the operational, ideological, and administrative realities of the Nizari state are largely absent. Historians emphasize that these portrayals reflect narrative convenience and entertainment priorities, rather than rigorous reconstruction of events. Critical engagement with these representations highlights the need to separate myth from documented history. The persistence of the myth also illustrates broader patterns in the reception of non-Western history. Orientalist and popular depictions often prioritize spectacle and moral framing over empirical evidence, reinforcing stereotypes and limiting nuanced understanding. Scholarly reassessment relies on cross-referencing multiple primary sources, including Persian chronicles, Nizari administrative texts, and archaeological surveys, to correct misconceptions and clarify the operational, political, and doctrinal realities of the community. Such methodology reveals the Nizaris as a rational, adaptive, and resilient movement rather than a sect defined by fanaticism or terror. Understanding the assassin myth within the context of historiography allows contemporary audiences to critically evaluate sources. The exaggeration of secrecy, the attribution of almost supernatural abilities to Fidois, and the framing of the community as a perpetual threat all illustrate how cultural imagination can overwrite historical evidence. Recognizing these distortions encourages a more sophisticated consumption of history, where sensational accounts are assessed alongside corroborated evidence and contextual analysis. This approach underscores the importance of academic rigor in interpreting the past. The enduring fascination with the assassins also demonstrates the interplay between history and narrative. While popular culture preserved the memory of the Nizaris, it did so in a form divorced from empirical reality. Historians now differentiate between the practical mechanisms of survival, administration, and strategic violence, and the fictionalized accounts that have dominated imagination for centuries. The contrast between these perspectives highlights both the resilience of historical memory and the necessity of critical reassessment. Scholarly reassessment thus offers clarity. By integrating Persian and Syrian chronicles, archaeological data, and Nizari doctrinal texts, modern historiography reconstructs a community characterized by administrative sophistication, disciplined operational systems, and ideological adaptability. This perspective corrects popular misconceptions while preserving the historical significance of the Nizari's achievements. It emphasizes that the assassins' influence was rooted not in mythic terror but in strategic, organizational, and doctrinal effectiveness. Before you leave, subscribe to Nightfall History for daily deep dives into civilizations, empires, and hidden histories. Click the bell icon to never miss a video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspect of the assassin's history surprised you the most?